I'm trying to start the recording and it's giving me a lot of trouble.
I think that takes a lot of your bandwidth also.
Well, they're two different internet sources, so
Okay.
we will see how that works. Okay, welcome to our fifth lesson in our study of the last half of Acts, to the ends of the earth. We are finishing chapter 15 tonight, which we did most of last night, and we're going through chapter 16, but almost all of you I know were with us when we did Acts 16 in the spring, so as an intro to Philippians. So we're going to really kind of front load. We can't cover it all, so we're going to cover the end of chapter 15 most substantially. Sorry, Kathleen, I know you were not here, but you know, we would have to skip something anyway. So someone remind us where we are in the story. What has been happening?
Well, last week they were arguing about circumcision, but it was really about like, what rules apply now that we are the new church, and how do we solve conflict, and how do we take it up the food chain?
Yeah, so I caught some of that. I'm sure it was really good. I wish I'd heard every word. But we're talking about which were the rules and what applies to Jews and Gentiles. Is the council met and had that conversation, and they made some decisions, and those decisions are being disseminated out to the churches, right? So let's read Acts 15. Let's pick up at verse 36 and read through 41, if someone would do that for us.
After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaimed the word of the Lord, and see how they are." Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches.
Thank you.
That's what I was talking about or asking last time, that what is the reason that they had such a different point of view, that other man couldn't go because he stopped helping them, and that, and
Yeah.
and something else I would ask before, but anyway, you said we would talk about it this time.
And here we are. Yep, exactly. So this is a curious story because we just don't have all the information we would really love to have, right? We would like to know more about this, but we are going to talk about it. So first, let's point out, like, what are they headed out for? What is Paul eager to do?
Feels like he wants to check up on all of his children.
Yeah. You know, the way you say that really kind of brings out maybe Paul's feelings for them, right? Like, he seems very eager to go do the mama bear thing, right? He's remember that we talked about after he was like violently treated and kicked out of all these cities, then he stops back by all these same cities on his way back because he's just very concerned about these churches. So this is part of what Paul did, and he must really miss them. We hear that in some of his letters where he talks about longing for these people or caring for them like a mother. And so we know he really does want to know that they're doing okay, right? And also he has news, right? The news from the council. So how did the church in Antioch receive the news that they didn't need to be circumcised? If you look back in 1531.
They were pretty happy about it.
Yeah, they had a lot of joy, and I think we could say maybe relief. So Paul wants to make sure the news is getting to the new churches too, and that they can feel, their minds put in this point, right? So he wants to get there, but he and Barnabas, they had this disagreement. And what is the problem?
Whether or not to
Mark?
take John Mark with them.
Yeah, John Mark. Okay. So the scripture will sometimes call him Mark and sometimes call him John, also called Mark. And so we have several items that, like, little points that we know about him. What do we know about John, also called Mark?
He'd been with them previously as a helper.
Yeah, in the previous mission journey, right, in in chapter 13, Barnabas and Paul it says the two of them set off, and John Mark was with them as their helper, right? And that word for helper can be a word for minister, but, we think he was the assistant, like he's running support staff. They're sending him to the market to get food. We don't know exactly what he was doing, but they want to have a helper. We can tell because they add a helper later in this journey when they get to Timothy, right? So they need this helper, and they pick John Mark and they take him with them. What do we know about John Mark from before that?
You mean that he'd been on a trip with them before and then he left them and went back to Jerusalem? That part? Or
That was this. This is
okay.
it. Yes, he left them and went. That's
what did
exactly
he know
right.
before?
Yeah, we have a couple of things. Turn to 12:12.
Yeah, I don't remember this guy.
I think it's hard to always connect. They don't always call him John Mark. Like, could you just call him John Mark every time? But we get John also called Mark in this. In chapter 12, Peter is in prison, and it's the night before Herod's trial of him, in which point he would presumably be beheaded.
They were at his mom's house.
Right, yeah. So the angel pulls Peter out of prison, and he thinks it's a dream. He doesn't know it's real until the angel disappears and he's like left standing in the street. And he's like, I wonder where I should go now that I am just randomly standing in the street and I'm supposed to be in jail. And what he does is go to the first place he thinks of, or the place he knows that believers will be meeting, is the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. So we can tell that this was like a faithful family, and a family that was hosting believers, because he goes there and they are in fact there praying for him. And then, there's that whole humorous thing where he knocks on the door and the servant doesn't let him in, instead goes and just says, Peter's outside. And even though they're praying for him, they don't believe her. It's a fun story. Just kind of highlighting the humanity of the church and the people involved. But we can tell that Mary and John Mark are kind of a wealthy family, because they have this home that is in the upper city. It has an outer gate with a servant to man it, right? So that would be a wealthy situation. And we can tell that they're faithful because Peter knew the believers would be meeting there. And yes, the believers were meeting there. So a good Jewish, faithful Christian family. All right, and then we know that Barnabas and John Mark are cousins or relatives. It's just a generic term, and we know that from one of Paul's letters. He refers to John Mark as the cousin of Barnabas. So they are related. Yeah, and then so they take him with him, he's their assistant, and then he leaves. Let's look over at the verse where he leaves. This is Acts 13:13. All right, what do we learn about him leaving from Acts 13:13?
He left them to return to Jerusalem.
Everybody's frozen, so if somebody's answering, I can't hear it.
He left them to return to Jerusalem.
Yeah, why did he leave?
We never know.
We never know this, right? I really want to know. If we do some just thinking through that, why he might have left, we notice that before this, they were on the island of Cyprus. And we know Barnabas had relatives in Cyprus. So if Barnabas and John Mark are relatives, then John Mark had relatives in Cyprus. So before this, they're in a place where they have relatives. They're primarily ministering to Jewish communities. And then they sail back to the mainland, and they're in these primarily Greek, Roman communities that are heavily patriotic towards the emperor and emperor worship, and heavily pagan in their temples and all of the pagan worship there. So we can think of like what that experience might have been for John Mark, who was from Jerusalem. What are some ideas? What might that have been like?
Well, my study Bible indicates he could have been homesick to get back to
what do you think?
Jerusalem. So like it wasn't comfortable, he was out of his element. It says that he could be homesick, or that the change in leadership between Barnabas and Paul are all reasons suggested for his return, but that Paul was dissatisfied with his departure.
Yeah. So we have to just kind of imagine what it might have been like. But yeah, maybe homesick, maybe frightened, because when they get to the mainland, like now they're in the big time. Greco-Roman cities, maybe very different than John Mark was used to, and he may have been overwhelmed by that, or he may have sensed the resistance in these cities was increasing. You know, we saw Paul endured some rough treatment in these cities. And John Mark may have gotten scared. But Paul, yes, was dissatisfied at it. What word does Paul use in 15:38?
He did not think it was wise to take him, is what I have.
Not wise to take him because
He had deserted him.
yeah. So if Paul thinks he deserted them, that's a strong statement, right? Paul apparently really felt that loss personally, right? And he's like, no, we're not doing it again. How did Barnabas seem to feel compared to Paul? And why do you think it was different?
So Barnabas wants to take him along and seems to disagree with Paul over this. And what we know about Paul is a rules guy, and Barnabas is an encourager guy. And so, I mean, this is entirely extrapolating, but it could just be that it was like, you know, give him another chance versus we don't have enough resources to give up, you know, to depend on someone that is not dependable.
Well,
Ah.
after splitting up into two sets instead, because they weren't at the same, what you just said, that he didn't necessarily like the idea of it. Did they still communicate, or were they just like mad at each other because or something? I don't know.
maybe Barnabas was more empathetic for whatever reason it was that John Mark left, and Paul saw it more as desertion and leaving to not follow through on the mission.
Yes,
Yeah.
I was just wondering if they ever communicated it again.
We're going to follow up on that too. Yeah. So I think these are great points. It really paints a picture, right? So Barnabas is the encourager guy, right? He's the empathetic guy. We know that when Paul showed up in Jerusalem, recently the persecutor of Christians and now preaching Jesus and the gospel of Jesus, Barnabas was the one that gave Paul a chance. Barnabas is the one that took him around to the apostles and said, no, he's changed. Give him another chance. And so this is Barnabas's gift, right? He's good at encouraging. He's good at giving other chances. And John Mark is his relative, probably his younger relative. And so that idea of like the mentoring and bringing him along. And if he deserted once, maybe we can help him grow into more stability and more, perseverance, right? I think that is exactly where Barnabas is living in it. And then Paul, you made a great point, like the mission doesn't just have unlimited resources that we can just take along someone who is then going to not help when we need help. And so this sharp disagreement that it says appears to be quite a substantial thing because they end up separating over it. But, we're looking at it and going, well, who's right and who's wrong? Well, is that the right question? How do you view this? What do you think we can see out of this?
I think
Doesn't
it's
have to be a
important.
right and wrong. It's just a difference.
Yeah, different point of view of how you should do just tell about the Lord. But going back when you first started about him going, both of them going back to talk to the people again, see how if they are prospering or understanding better, to not make themselves, feel better. Hey, I actually accomplished something. I'm getting somewhere, but for them to double check.
Yeah. And we know that was a big concern of Paul's because he wants to know that that his work hasn't been in vain, that he hasn't been poured out for nothing, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely.
I think it's important to notice that they both kept working.
Yeah.
They didn't stop, they didn't give up, they didn't walk away. They just went different ways and they kept working for the gospel of Christ.
Yeah, I think that's true. And obviously this disagreement was painful, right? I don't think that I don't think this scripture like sugarcoats this in that, like it tells us that there was a sharp disagreement. So I think it probably really hurt them. And yet, you make a great point. They both went into the mission field. They both kept telling the gospel. And so one thing I think that's instructive is to see like, well, what happened later? And Luke in the book of Acts never returns to the Barnabas and John Mark branch of the story, right? He joins Paul. He's about to like become a part of the mission party in chapter 16. He joins Paul and travels with Paul, and Paul is the main source for his story of the church. And so he doesn't go back to the Barnabas, and we're like, what happened? But we do have information about what happened because Paul mentions Barnabas and John Mark in his letters. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to give you kind of a little rundown of what the mentions are. So in 1 Corinthians, Paul is writing the Corinthian church probably about 4 years after this incident. And he is arguing with them about how they think less of him because they didn't pay him. And he says, or do only Barnabas and I have a right not to refrain from working? So not have a right to refrain from working. He's basically saying, is it only Barnabas and I that have to work for a living because of this argument? But you know, he partners himself with Barnabas. He refers to Barnabas as a partner, even though this is some years later and they didn't go to Corinth on that first trip. So there had to have been some partnership there in between. Later in Colossians, this is Colossians 4:10, Paul is giving some greetings at the end of the book, and he's saying, Aristarchus sends you his greetings. Also, Barnabas' cousin Mark, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. So there's a little miniature commendation for John Mark. And then in Philemon, a book that is a really short letter that Paul writes to a slave owner about a slave relationship. At the very end, he says, Epaphras greets you, as do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. So at that point, this is later when Paul is in prison, Mark is of the status of my fellow workers. And then at the very end of Paul's life, when he's writing Timothy, you know, who we're just about to meet, here, he's in prison in Rome, awaiting what will turn out to be execution. And he sends Timothy instructions. He wants his scrolls and parchments. He wants Timothy to come see him. And he says, pick up Mark. This is 2 Timothy 4:11. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me in my service. So at the end of his life, Paul is asking for John Mark to be with him and asking for him to come and see him and be helpful to him.
Something I was just wondering about, it's not what you're talking about now, but when they were going to all these different cities and things, and maybe a different culture or speech and all of that, I assume they were, trying to explain it all the same way, but did they all understand it the same way? Because there's so many different points of view of religion throughout the world.
Yeah, I mean, good question. There would have to be some differences. And Paul speaks differently to different groups. He speaks differently to Jews than to Gentiles. Yeah. Yeah. And maybe John Mark didn't have the same perspective as Paul at that point when he left. You know, that was one idea that was brought up, and I think it's a good one. But over the course of their lives, they are still partners with each other, still fellow workers, still longing to see, Paul wants to see John Mark at the end of his life.
Yeah.
Questions or comments on this little section?
I think it's helpful that we have enough information to know what the foundation of the disagreement is, but not enough for who to know who's right.
Gretchen, could you say that one more time?
I think it's helpful, actually, that we have enough information to understand what the disagreement is about, but not enough to be able to come to a conclusion or argue about who's right.
I'm frustrated. I really want to hear that, and I got nothing. I didn't even give it part of the words.
Okay, I'll put
Maybe you can chat her. Yeah.
Chat would be super. There's my chat window. There it is. Other thoughts while she's typing? Okay. I like Aaron made a comment. I think it was just to me, but I like it. You know, just Paul was that strong personality. You know, maybe he just, if he can't trust someone, that's a big deal to some personalities, right? Whereas Barnabas was able to make those different allowances. Okay, from Gretchen. I think it's helpful as a model that we have enough information to understand the basic premise of the disagreement, but not enough to be able to formulate who's right. Yeah. This is such a great point. How much of how we deal with conflict is valuing who's right more than the relationship, right? And, you know, notice how Luke deals with it, right? When Luke, this is a great point you're bringing out, because like when Luke first said, he went back to Jerusalem, he says it so neutrally, right? He doesn't say deserted there. It's just a simple, he left, he went to Jerusalem. There's no like hint of failure. You're like, oh, I guess that was fine. You don't even know until later that Paul was upset about it. And I think that's because Luke is writing, looking back on this story. And the important thing was the relationship. And he knows that the spread of the gospel was advanced over this time and that this rift was later healed. And so, yeah, just thinking about like, we don't know who's right. And also, maybe that's not what we need to know. Great point.
If there even was one right and one wrong.
Yeah.
In any wrong.
Right. When someone's scared, I mean, it's hard to hold that against someone. And yet, it's hard to hold it against Paul that he wanted reliability.
You know, some people are mission-minded, some people are people-minded, some people are, you know, some want to mend relationships and some want to keep the mission going, you know, and neither one is better than the other, probably. But, you know, I think we could argue both of them were right, and we could argue both of them were wrong. So
Say that last part again. I think we could argue.
I think we could argue both of them were right and both of them were wrong, which is why there are so many different types of people.
Yeah. It's a good model for us, right? Like sometimes we go our own ways and sometimes that's okay. And then sometimes that hurts the relationship and we have to make an effort to, you know, resolve to continue to emphasize the relationship and value the relationship. Okay, so you know, Paul, he doesn't want to take John Mark. Maybe this situation, you know, just like the persecution of Stephen served to advance the gospel because they were scattered. We have these two mission teams. And that doesn't make it a good thing that they disagree, and yet good comes out of it. Barnabas and Mark are probably very productive based on, you know, the fact that they're fellow workers years later. And then Paul takes Silas, and Silas was one of the people that the Jerusalem Council sent as, you know, reliable, mature people to take their letter, right? So Silas comes well recommended. He goes with Paul, and they head off into their mission. Let's read 1541 through 16:5, please. Is someone reading that and I just can't hear because I'm having a hard time.
You wanted 1541 through what?
1541 through 16:5.
Oh, 16:5.
Yeah,
It's
like
Yeah, I thought you said 65. I was like, it ends at 41.
oh yeah.
I was thinking, like,
I'm having
I'm not
all kinds of trouble.
I can read that. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer. A lot of feedback. But his father was Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers of Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith, and they increased in numbers daily.
Thank you. Okay, so I can show you a little map. This is a little bit interesting. I don't know, it's kind of nerdy interesting maybe. Oh, I didn't bring it up, man. One moment. I have a map. I like things that are nerdy interesting. Okay. Okay, so this is the map of the region, right? So we have the Mediterranean Sea here, and here's Jerusalem, and this is, you know, Syria today as well. And so they start out in Syria and Antioch. And last time, look, they sailed and went to Cyprus, and then went to the island, and then they sailed again and came back up here at Derbe and Iconium, you know, Lystra, all these places. And then they went back over land. This time they just head out over land, but their first stop is still this same group of churches, right? So they kind of preach through this region, and in a minute, you know, through the rest of the chapter, because I'm not going to bring the map back up, they go all the way across what's called Asia. It's modern day Turkey, and they end up in Troas, which is a port city. And when they end up sailing, they go across the Aegean Sea to what, you know, the Macedonian Peninsula, where Greece is. And that's how they end up at Philippi. So this is kind of the route for the journey. And then in this case, they take the sea, you know, they sail some back and end up sailing back to Jerusalem at the end of the journey. That's next week. But that way, at least you get to see the map.
Yeah, the map was always
so
cool to look at. And
yeah, and I promised, I realized this afternoon, I had a crazy day with a refrigerator failing and lots of drama at my house. But I realized this afternoon that I never sent you the map from last time. So I'm going to send you that map and the one before. I'll send you a little set of maps to everybody, so that you have maps.
okay, that's cool.
So yeah, so they go back to these same churches, right? They're going, and what is like their main thing that they're doing? They talk about it in 16:4.
Communicating the decisions.
Yeah, they're delivering this, the council decision. And then, you know, it talks about the churches were strengthened and grew daily. So they're like encouraging people, they're preaching to new people so that they're getting new members, and they're delivering this decision. And that's kind of the pattern as they go through this area. Now, who else joins them in this section? Verse 1, 16:1.
Timothy.
Yeah, Timothy. And this is the first mention of Timothy in the scripture, right? So we're just now meeting him, but we learned quite a bit about him in this section. What do we learn?
He was the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer.
Yes, yeah, a Jew and a believer, yes. And that's his mom. And then what about his dad?
His father was Greek.
Father was a Greek.
Yeah, so would we assume that the father is a believer or not?
In a
Well,
different
they don't
way,
mention it.
kind of, I assume. I don't know.
So the way that this is written, she's a Jew and a believer, and he's a Greek. Probably
kind of
not,
implies
right?
maybe not.
Yeah. probably not a believer. And we see that the brothers in the city speak well of him. So he is clearly a believer himself. So what does that say about like his religion, his faith, his upbringing?
Probably grounded in his Jewish faith with his mother.
Yeah, probably following that side of belief where as his mother's example, that he has followed the Jewish faith and then believed in the Jewish Messiah as Jesus, right? And what is his big barrier to his life of Jewish faith and his believing life?
Circumcision.
Ah, how would this have been for him growing up and being a young man?
I think it would have not quite fit in either world,
Yeah,
which is a hard place to be when you're growing up.
so hard, right? Yeah, I feel like there's a lot we can really gather from just these few sentences that he wouldn't have fit, right? Jews went to Jerusalem to go to the temple. Is he allowed in the temple? It's not. No, he's not circumcised. He's not allowed in the temple. He can't even go in. And that was something that was so important to this group of people. And then he's not even allowed to go in. And it says everyone in the area knew his father was a Greek. They all knew he wasn't circumcised, right? Probably his father wouldn't let him be circumcised. That would be the expected thing. Like the Greeks did not regard circumcision well, and his father wasn't a believer. And so, you know, he was like, no, you can tell them all about your Jewish God, but I'm going to draw the line at circumcision. We're not doing that. And so he's grown up his whole life, a man without a country, right? Like in between two worlds, not fitting anywhere. Probably this mixed ethnicity has really affected him and made him an outsider to both Jews and to Greeks, right? And what does Paul want Timothy to do?
Circumcised.
Well, does he want him to travel with him? And that's why, I mean, he wants him to come along and be completely accessible to everything. So does that drive the circumcision? Like he wanted him to come along. And so, well, to do that, you have to do this.
Right. Why would it be helpful for him to be circumcised to come along?
They were going to be talking to Jewish people, and this would be just preventing it being a stumbling block.
Right. So this passage can be so confusing, right? Because Paul has just like made his stand about, no, you don't have to be circumcised, right? He's just gone and testified to the council about how none of the Gentiles need to be circumcised because God has accepted them without. And he's, you know, we know from Galatians that he and Peter have had a real, you know, come to Jesus, so to speak, meeting about this issue. And then Peter has, you know, changed his mind and testified to the council to that effect. You know, like all this has gone down about circumcision. And the next thing Paul does is turn around and have somebody circumcised. So it can be sort of mind-boggling, but you make a great point about the removal of a stumbling block. There's also this thing about like, it was the Gentiles that Paul said didn't have to be circumcised, right? Who would Paul expect to still get circumcised?
Jews.
Right, like the Jewish babies still going to go to the temple and be circumcised on the 8th day. Like all of that is still going to happen, right? Circumcision isn't over for the Jews.
But it's not an issue of salvation anymore.
Right. So here it's like, he doesn't care about circumcision either way. It's okay with him to go ahead and say like, oh, this is going to be a stumbling block. Let's just have you circumcised. And apparently Timothy agrees, and it may have really put Timothy in a better place than he had grown up being. I wonder that. I wonder if there's also some compassion for Timothy being in this no man's land that is driving this as well.
I've
What do you
also
all think?
talking about something before that was it the people from Jerusalem or that the Jews that they wanted the ones and the people that were becoming or wanting to become Christian, and it was a different point of view that the Jews wanted them to do it like them, their way.
Their way, right.
And I didn't know if they actually thought about it and agreed, or do it your way. You can do that if you want. I didn't know. That was back before, but I'm sorry.
Well, I think part of it is that you don't have to become Jewish and then become Christian.
No, it's just I'm talking about their points of like if you become and believe in the Lord, would they have to do it?
Yeah.
Right.
The circumcision.
Right. And you're right, they wouldn't have to be. But here, this seems like this was the best thing for Timothy and for the mission that Paul is emphasizing. Now he can go everywhere with Paul without this circumcision that everybody in the area knows about being a distraction from the message of Jesus. He can go into the synagogues without anybody thinking like, you shouldn't be bringing this uncircumcised person in here. And, it can be all about the mission. This really reminded me of a passage from 1 Corinthians that, Paul is reflecting back, and maybe this is part of what he's reflecting back on. In 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 23, he says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more. To the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, as without the law, though I am not without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker in it." I think there's some same principles in that passage. What do y'all notice?
I wonder if this could be interpreted as, to be a follower of Christ, you have a lot of freedoms and a lot of leeway and a lot of space in which you can comfortably exist. But if you are going to be someone who ministers the gospel to people, you have to be prepared to be in a slightly more complicated place where you maybe do things that are uncomfortable or not strictly necessary, so that you can make a space in which other people can safely enter into the gospel and enter into the body of Christ.
Yeah, that sort of that above and beyond feeling that we're getting from Paul there. Yeah, and tell you about that as you are a minister. It's such a great point, because don't we all grow into ministry as we mature? And so, like, yes, there's lots of ways of being that are okay. But as we mature into people who can be all things to all people, who might have to be as, weak to win the weak, as something, as a situation that we know isn't really restrictive to us, and yet it's okay because of that growth into maturity. Yeah, this passage speaks to me. I feel like there's a priority on self-forgetfulness and on self-sacrifice here, and on being willing to set aside maybe our natural tendencies of being for a way that helps someone else. And that's hard.
Yeah, since taking on youth ministry, like there's a lot of things I can no longer get away with. Start there.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Where else does this speak to anybody? There seems like an emphasis here on fellowship too, as opposed to division, right? Like, even though he's circumcised, which is the opposite of the ruling, which is you don't have to be circumcised, in both cases, it's to bring people together. And so that emphasis on, like, we'll do what we need to do for unity, for togetherness, for access and time together. Any other thoughts on this one? Well, they have their small missionary party, right? So we've got Paul and Silas, and now they've got an assistant in Timothy, and they preach and encourage their way across this area, right? Asia, which is modern day Turkey, to the port of Troas. So I showed you on the map, okay? And so right there's where they have this mission, the vision asking for them to come to Macedonia. So they get on a boat, they sail across. Now it's we. So Luke has joined them. So they've got at least 4 then by the time they get to sailing, and they land over on the other side of the Aegean Sea in Macedonia, and there they go overland to Philippi. And we get this beautiful set of really rich stories in Philippi. We get the first host of the church in Philippi, Lydia. She's a well-to-do businesswoman, right? She's, we have all kinds, right? It takes all kinds. And so the well-to-do businesswoman and Gentile is willing to believe. The Spirit works in her heart, and she becomes the first host, so that she's hosting them in her home. She's a head of a household, and her household believes. She is the last person they mention before they leave Philippi at the end of the chapter, where they meet with the brothers. And so this household is so important. We meet the slave girl with a prophetic spirit who's just being exploited for that spirit, and Paul casts it out, and because of that gets himself in so much trouble, ends up in jail. And in jail he meets the jailer, who is about to die, right? He is about to take his own life because his life is forfeit if his prisoners escape. And his exclamation is, "What must I do to be saved?" And it's like, what do I have to do to be rescued from this situation where my life is forfeit? Mm-hmm. And more, even more, what must I do to experience the salvation of Jesus Christ, right? And it's both. And Luke really draws all of that together so that we have a wealthy Gentile God-fearing woman, a Roman soldier, a faithful servant and jailer, so the church obviously starts out very diverse, and that will be the church that he writes to with such love and affection in Philippians, right? So great stories there.
all pointing to the power of the gospel through that time. Questions or comments on the end of the chapter? We kind of just skimmed through it, and we're going to pick up chapter 17 next week, but anything you notice or want to say? Well, I'll wrap us up. We're just about out of time. I'm looking forward to this next part when we get more of the Gentile mission and we get to hear more of Paul's message to the Gentiles. So we'll be reading that next week. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the recorder so that we can talk prayer requests.